Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon, episode 75, King Louis Bonaparte of Holland and Napoleon's protege. Before we begin, I'd like to take this moment to provide a 75th episode progress report to our wonderful listeners around the world. I truly believe that our podcast has the best audience, and I appreciate each and every one of you who listens to the show and shares it with their friends and family. We began this podcast in June 2022, and we just reached 87,000 total listens/downloads. We have great ratings and reviews thanks to our great listeners, with a 4.8 rating on Apple Podcasts and a 4.7 rating on Spotify. Many thanks again. On Patreon, we have 7 paying members and 15 total members. If you'd like to support our podcast, please head on over to patreon.com/Generals and Napoleon, where we have a free member option, a $5 a month option to become General of Division, or a $10 a month option to become Marshal of the Empire. If you'd like to support our podcast in another way, please go to our YouTube page and hit the subscribe button. We have 81 videos posted there, including a few YouTube lives that you cannot find anywhere else. In those lives, I rank Napoleon's 26 marshals, I review the new Napoleon movie, and I recommend books on the Napoleonic era. As always, I appreciate all of our subscribers, listeners, Patreon members, and supporters. As the Emperor Napoleon once stated, quote, "I embrace you all. Be always gallant and good," end quote. Now, on with the show. We have a special guest joining us once again, a good friend, Graeme Callister, who is a great author. I recommend you check out his books on Amazon or wherever books are sold. Graeme, how are you, sir?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
I'm very well. Thanks for joining us. Who are we talking about today on this episode?
I think today we're going to talk about Louis Bonaparte.
Louis was born in Ajaccio, Corsica in 1778 in September. So he was a good bit younger than his more famous brother, Napoleon. Was his upbringing different than Napoleon and Joseph's?
Yeah, it was somewhat. Louis is 9 years younger than Napoleon, and he's the 5th child to survive in an increasingly financially stretched family. Their father takes Napoleon and Joseph to France when Louis is only 2 months old, so Louis doesn't really get to meet his eldest brothers for some years. Like his other brothers, he is educated in Corsica by his uncle. And probably like Napoleon and Joseph, him and Lucien got up to various youthful escapades and bits of daring do. But Lucien is taken off to France when Louis is only 5, so really he grows up as the only boy in the house, unlike maybe the others. His father also dies when Louis is only about 7, so the family are in real financial trouble after that. When Napoleon comes home in 1787 on leave, it seems that Louis is really starstruck by him. He becomes a bit of a hero figure for Louis. So unlike Napoleon, who kind of made his own way in the world, it seems, Louis has this elder brother figure who he really looks up to. He looks up a bit to Joseph, but it's Napoleon that Louis really looks up to. Napoleon actually wanted to take Louis back to France with him to educate him. But it wasn't until 1791 that he was able to do that. And Louis went over to France with Napoleon acting as his guardian, as his mentor. And I think they both very much enjoyed this relationship. So Louis has this quite different upbringing because he's got these elder brother figures.
Right. And the early part of his career was spent as ADC, or aide-de-camp, to Napoleon in Italy. And he was present at the important battles of Arcola and Rivoli. He also served in Egypt, and it seems like Napoleon really looked after Louis, which, he looked after all of his siblings, as we'll find out later, giving them kingdoms and titles and dukedoms and that kind of thing. But it seems like you mentioned he and Louis had a special bond.
Yeah, it really does seem that way. And I think Napoleon sees him very much as a protege. He tried this with Lucien as well, but Lucien had more or less rebelled against this kind of older brother's presence. But Louis very much looks up to Napoleon. Napoleon sees Louis as someone who can follow in his footsteps, someone who he can educate and help his career along. It's all, of course, on Napoleon's terms, and you might say even a mild bullying involved to force Louis into certain things. But definitely Napoleon's taking Louis under his wing and getting him to follow in his own footsteps. Louis is eventually sent back to military training school to finish his training as an artillery officer, again following in Napoleon's footsteps. Napoleon pulls various levers to get him there. He gets him a command or a position with an artillery battery in Saint-Tropez for a time. And as you said, he appoints him as an aide-de-camp in the Italian campaigns, where Louis really thrives for a short time. Napoleon doesn't spare Louis. He sends him out into action. He sends him off as a messenger. Louis is there next to Napoleon on the bridge at Arcola, leading from the front. He's under fire for a lot of this. Napoleon doesn't spare him, but Napoleon thinks this is all part of his military education, and he very much imagines that Louis is going to be like him, rise up and become a general, become a great man, and very much this is the chosen path that Napoleon has for Louis.
Right. And like you mentioned, he was undoubtedly brave and he was following in his brother's footsteps. I think he just lacked the charisma of Napoleon.
Yeah, and unfortunately, he does kind of fade a bit. From 1797, he starts to become ill quite frequently, which means he can't continue on campaign. He spends various bits of time in somewhat dissipated, drunken debaucheries. One of them after he'd fallen in love, and Napoleon had married off the woman he was in love with to someone else, and so he goes drinking for a while, and so he goes off the rails a bit and starts to resent maybe Napoleon's attention a bit more. But in these early years, he very much seems to be Napoleon's protege and the one that Napoleon's earmarked to be the one to follow in his footsteps.
Yeah, and in 1802, he's put into an arranged marriage with Josephine's daughter, Hortense, Hortense is a very smart young lady. She was actually infatuated, I think, with General Duroc. And as you mentioned, Louis had loved others, not Hortense particularly. So although the idea looked good on paper, this marriage never really worked, did it?
No, unfortunately not. This is all part of Napoleon again seeing Louis as his protege. So in January 1801, Napoleon's just survived an assassination attempt. Napoleon is thinking in terms of a succession. Now, he's not hereditary at this point, but clearly it's in his mind that he might be at some time. And he basically chooses Louis to be his future heir if he needs one. The thinking being that Joseph wouldn't outlive Napoleon because he's older. Lucien was too erratic, Jerome was too young, so Louis was the chosen man. And to strengthen that bond, he wants to marry Louis off to Hortense, who's Josephine's daughter. So his niece in his stepdaughter, and Louis's niece-in-law. So they have this arranged marriage, and Louis, for a short time, is infatuated with this girl. She is young, beautiful, witty, graceful, very much highly sought after for herself and for her own charms, not just for her connection to Napoleon. And
Yeah.
for a few months, he's very much attracted to her.
Yeah. An accomplished composer. I know she was fond of billiards, and it seemed like she really knew how to network. Like she was her own woman without Louis. Before they met, like she was very talented in her own right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think any man in Paris would have been glad to have her as a wife and proud to have wooed such a wonderful young lady. But Louis kind of rebels against this. Part of this may be because the lady that he'd pined after in 1798 and wanted to marry then was actually a cousin of Hortense. So a kind of one of the extended Beauharnais clan, one of Josephine's nieces, and she'd been taken away from him, so possibly there's a bitterness there. But once they get married, Louis, after about 2 months, just becomes an absentee husband. The marriage sours. Louis starts to think he's been pressured into the whole thing, and finds a number of excuses to go off and abandon his wife. So he goes back to his regiment, and then he claims an illness and goes to take the waters. And then he decides he has to be in Paris while his wife is in the country. And it becomes quite a loveless and quite unhappy marriage. And Hortense is pretty unhappy in this whole thing, and she basically goes back to the Tuileries to spend her time with Napoleon and Josephine.
Yep.
And this becomes the pattern of the marriage. There's brief times when they're together, and then one finds an excuse to leave. They do officially have 3 children, so they do spend these bits of time together, but there are also major rumors of extramarital affairs all over the place.
Right.
And it's unfortunately a deeply unhappy marriage.
Yeah, and we'll come back to the children here in a bit. And as you mentioned, Louis is working on his career. He's promoted to General of Brigade in 1803 and then General Division in 1804. And then the big promotion is 1806, where Louis is crowned King of Holland by Napoleon's decree. How did he do in this role? Because just putting it against Joseph's kingdom in Naples and Jerome's kingdom in Westphalia, how did Louis do in Holland?
Louis is much more a Joseph than a Jerome. He takes this very seriously. By 1806, he's had about a decade where he's been increasingly shy from work and avoiding things and claiming to be ill, and probably suffering from bouts of mental illness. But he really throws himself into being king. He wants to be a good man. He wants to be a good monarch, but unfortunately, he's quite indecisive. He's a bit prone to stubbornness rather than strength, and he struggles really to reconcile the needs of his subjects with the demands of his brother. He personally, takes the lead in a lot of things in the Netherlands. When there are disasters, whether man-made or natural, from flooding to explosions of an ammunition barge to the British invasion of 1809, Louis is the one to lead the relief efforts. He genuinely makes efforts, and he's well liked for that. He also genuinely listens to his advisors, mostly the Dutch advisors rather than French, which annoys Napoleon, but he does listen. He tries to make himself a figurehead for the state. When he leaves Paris, Napoleon says to him as pretty much the last thing, never forget that you're a Frenchman. And the minute that Louis steps over the frontier and is greeted by his new subjects, he declares, I am now a Dutchman.
Right.
So he's trying to do everything, but unfortunately, he's the kind of guy who focuses maybe on the minutiae rather than the big picture. He doesn't like to make big decisions. He likes reform, but he doesn't like to let reforms bed in. And so his government isn't massively successful, but he tries very hard.
Yeah, and he does. He learns the way of he tries to learn the ways of the Dutch. He tries to learn the language. Unlike his brother Jerome, King of Westphalia, who just wanted to enjoy the luxuries of being a king. It must have been tricky to be king of a foreign country, but still subject to the whims and commands of Napoleon. I'm trying to think of how I would act in the role, because you want to do what's best for your subjects, but you also have to remember that Napoleon put you on that throne. So how do you do both at the same time?
Yeah, it really makes Louis's life impossible. He had this honourable but somewhat naive view that he was there to rule for the benefit of the Netherlands, whereas Napoleon believed he was there to rule the Netherlands on France's behalf. And Napoleon sends orders, not even disguised as diplomatic requests or as brotherly instruction or brotherly advice. He just sends orders to Louis and tells him to carry it out. And when Louis refuses, Napoleon sends very nasty letters to him. He accuses him of having betrayed him, of failing, of acting like the brother of the King of England instead of the brother of the Emperor of France. He calls him a miserable personality. These are really unpleasant letters. But Louis holds firm, and Louis refuses to impose conscription, to impose the Code Napoleon. He says that existing Dutch codes are better. He does have to pass legislation to back up the continental system and the continental blockade and ban British trade, but then he does absolutely nothing to enforce them. So he basically, gives a nod and a wink to allow British trade to come in, and Napoleon is furious by all of this. And by 1808, 1809, he is beginning to threaten Louis and say, either you start to do what I tell you, or your country will not be a country anymore.
Right. Yeah, and it gets more problematic from there. Louis forces his court and ministers to speak only Dutch. He wants them to give up their French citizenships, which rubbed many of them the wrong way. And it's also said he was jealous of Hortense, whom the Dutch seemed really drawn to instead of him. He also changed the capital city over a dozen times, Amsterdam, Utrecht, among others. That doesn't really help the stability of a regime, does it?
No, and again, this comes down to Louis's indecisiveness and his zeal for reform. he wants to change things, he wants to reform, but then he gets bored after a few months of the new way of doing things, so he changes again. And at some point, people say, well, this isn't just reform, this is just change for the sake of it. He also fails to act in concert with his wife, really. She could very much have charmed the Dutch court while he ruled, but instead he kind of petulantly starts to see her as a rival in a popularity contest, and so he resents that. Unfortunately, he ends up tolerated by his Dutch subjects, liked for his goodness, but not really respected for strength, estranged from his wife, unpopular with the few Frenchmen who'd actually been sent to keep an eye on him because they're being told they can't be French anymore. And he is a constant source of irritation to his imperial brother. So unfortunately, by the start of 1810, there's really no one batting for, the rule of Louis in Holland.
Right. And as you mentioned, in 1810, kind of things come to a head, and Louis is forced to abdicate his throne after several falling outs with Napoleon. And the French soon annex Holland under Marshal Oudinot. What happens to Louis after this abdication?
Well, he actually tries to resist the French annexation. First of all, he refuses to abdicate when Napoleon tells him. Then when Napoleon annexes some of Dutch territory to try to force him to abdicate, Louis actually consults his generals and says, can we resist? Can we fight Napoleon? Can we get an international alliance going? Can we join a coalition maybe with the British?
Right.
And his generals just say no. We can't beat your brother.
Right.
We're not even going to try. So Louis does abdicate in favor of his son. He hopes that Napoleon would accept it, but Napoleon ignores it and annexes the country, which is kind of ironic for 1814 when Napoleon complains that people won't let him abdicate in favor of his own son. But Louis is pretty upset by this whole thing. He thinks his brother's treated him really shabbily, so he simply goes off without telling Napoleon where he's going. And a few months later, he pops up in Austria, which is now a French ally. So it's not like he's deserted to the enemy. But he doesn't come back to France. He lives abroad in a fit of pique. He spends a couple of years there. In 1813, he does go back to France, and he does request his old throne back as part of a general settlement, and says, make me King of Holland, and people might let you keep your throne. But Napoleon thinks by this stage he's worse than useless as a king because Louis isn't ruling in Napoleon's interest. So Napoleon has no interest in giving him a throne back. Louis does go back to France in 1814, but by this stage he's pretty badly ill. He's reported as walking with a stick, as looking prematurely aged, as being pretty infirm, and Napoleon doesn't give him any kind of formal role in the defense of France in 1814. He does ask him to support Joseph in defending the country, and actually writes him a couple of nice letters saying, I really appreciate your support. That you can continue to help me, those kind of things. But Louis really doesn't do much in 1814. He's also the only brother who doesn't rally to Napoleon in 1815. True to form, he claims to have been ill and just stays in Italy during the Waterloo campaign.
Interesting. Yeah, and I know he also gets separated and eventually divorced from Hortense. After Napoleon's final downfall, Louis dies in July 1846. So he lives quite a while, even with all of his mental deficiencies and sicknesses. He dies in Livorno, Italy. What is his legacy, which should probably include Napoleon III, who ruled France longer than his more famous uncle? Was he... Because I know Hortense did a lot of the raising of the kids herself. Should Louis get some credit in the raising of Napoleon III?
I think Louis doesn't really see his sons a huge amount, which is he really deeply regrets. He would like to be more with his sons, but he doesn't want to be near Hortense. So, he doesn't really see them. I think Louis must have had some kind of influence. He did write to his sons. He advised them. He wrote his memoirs as well, where he was kind of, I think, had one eye on advising his sons of what to do if they were ever in this situation for ruling, because he was quite honest with pointing out Napoleon's errors and saying, here's what you shouldn't do. Honest, but sometimes misguided. It's a bit of an apology for his own rule as King of Holland as well. But nonetheless, he has some influence, I think, over his sons. But Louis he kind of drifts into obscurity. He lasts 30 years after the downfall of his brother.
Right.
But he lives in exile outside France. He has very little contact with his family. He does reconcile with his mother and lives with her for a time. He does some writing, but he becomes quite obscure. He several times asks to be able to go back to his old country of Holland, so he clearly has this affinity for the Netherlands still. But he's not allowed to go back by William I, although William II does let him back. And then in 1840, he goes there traveling incognito just to visit his old kingdom. But he gets recognized, and people in the streets start cheering him and start shouting, God bless King Louis. And he's really moved by this, because I think by 1840 people have forgotten his indecisiveness or his inability to resist Napoleon's commands, and they just remember the Louis the Good,
Right.
the king who had tried to do well for the people, who had been at the forefront of relief for floods and whatever else. So, he has this great moment in 1840, which I think is nice. But the death of Napoleon's son in 1832 also opens the door for Louis to do more in the Bonaparte clan, really. Joseph is kind of the legitimate next in line, but Louis had always been the one that Napoleon had wanted to make his heirs. But Louis, just like Joseph, doesn't really do much to forward this cause. He's not very interested in trying to get on the throne of France or anything. But of course, his son was. Now, of the three sons, their first one, Charles Napoleon, had died in 1807. When he was just 4.5.
Right.
Their second son, Napoleon Louis, dies in 1831. Of measles, and it's the youngest son, Charles Louis Napoleon, who is then the guy who kind of takes up the mantle of the Bonapartist cause. His mother had brought him up very much as a good Bonapartist, to believe in the glory of empire, the glory of Napoleon. And Charles Louis Napoleon, in his youth, he falls in with Italian revolutionaries while living in Italy. He tries a couple of coups against the French regime. He has a number of adventures, including a Napoleon-style landing on the French coast with a few retainers to try to gain the throne by popular acclaim.
Mm-hmm.
And he gets arrested by some customs officers. He then is imprisoned in the fortress of Ham, where he escapes by dressing up as a washerwoman. So, it's this really, overblown stories about his life, but they're mostly true.
Right.
But it's the revolution of 1848 gives him his chance. And he is, as the son of Louis and Hortense, he'd been brought up in this great Bonapartist tradition, and he puts forward his Bonapartist credentials in 1848, gets himself elected president of the new republic, and then in 1851 launches his coup that creates the Second Empire. So it's Louis's son that carries on Napoleon's legacy. Louis himself has faded from view. Louis's son becomes Napoleon III. He re-establishes France's preeminent position, you could argue, with limited wars against Russia and Austria. But then, of course, he also suffers the even more catastrophic defeat than anything his uncle had ever suffered at Sedan in 1870.
Right.
But that, as they say, is another story.
Yeah, you just wish Hortense and Louis could have seen Napoleon III become Napoleon III. Unfortunately, they passed before he came into power. But I also think Louis, I wonder if he just made better decisions in dealing with his older brother, because he was most favored sibling for a long time. And, as you mentioned, even his first son was in line to be an heir before he died. So you just wonder if Louis had made a few different decisions in his lifetime, if he would have had a better relationship with Napoleon.
Yeah, it took a lot for Napoleon to kind of be alienated from Louis. But I also just feel that Napoleon's overbearingness eventually got to Louis, and he realized he couldn't live up to his brother's expectations, and then fell into a depression because of that, and everything spiraled from there.
Yeah.
So I as with many of Napoleon's intimates, I feel a bit sorry for Louis.
Yeah, indeed. Well, Graeme, thank you for that. Very interesting details on Louis' life, and I learned a lot, and hopefully my audience did as well. Again, if you like to learn more about Graeme, you can check him out on Twitter/X, or you can find his books on Amazon or wherever books are sold, and I highly recommend them. Graeme, thank you, my friend.
Thank you very much.